The summer when my closest friend, Sam, extended an invitation to his father's lake house, I anticipated a typical retreat filled with swimming, barbecuing, and leisurely afternoons. Sam and I had been inseparable since middle school, and his father, Richard, had always been a constant presence in our lives, akin to the background music of our friendship. He was the quintessential cool dad, humorous, easygoing, and the type of person who treated me as if I were one of his own children. I expected this summer to unfold in a similar manner, but I was mistaken. Upon our arrival on a sweltering July afternoon, our vehicle packed with snacks and equipment, the lake sparkled under the sun, presenting a picturesque escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. As we began to unload our belongings, Richard emerged onto the porch, his sunglasses glinting in the sunlight as he beckoned us over. "Finally, you two made it," he called out, his deep voice warm and inviting. He stood shirtless, clad only in swim trunks, his skin bronzed from countless hours spent outdoors, appearing more like an older brother than a father in his late 40s. This was a detail I had always noticed but never pondered deeply, however. This time an inexplicable flutter stirred within me. "Hey Dad," Sam said with a grin as he hoisted a cooler up the stairs. "You haven't consumed all the beer without us, have you?" Richard chuckled, giving Sam a friendly pat on the shoulder. "Not all of it, save some for you guys. Go get settled, dinner will be ready in an hour." I followed Sam inside, attempting to dismiss the strange sensation that had settled over me. I reassured myself that it was likely just the heat, reminding myself that this summer was meant for relaxation and enjoyment. Before we embarked on our college journeys, the initial days passed in a whirlwind of swimming, late-night conversations, and playful banter. Richard participated in most of our activities, creating an atmosphere that felt easy and comfortable. However, the dynamic shifted when Sam received a call from his girlfriend, Lauren, who was stuck at work and required his assistance with a project. I could see the guilt etched on his face as he relayed the situation. "I'll be back by dinner," he said, grabbing his keys. "Good hanging out here, my dad's around if you need anything, yeah." "No problem," I replied, waving him off. "Go save your damsel in distress," Sam laughed as he left, and I watched the car disappear up the gravel driveway. For the first time all week, the cabin was quiet. Just the sound of the lake lapping against the shore and birds calling in the distance. I wandered out to the deck, the sun beating down on my shoulders. The heat was oppressive, and I decided to cool off with a swim, stripping down to my trunks I into the lake, the water a refreshing shock against my skin. I floated there for a while, staring up at the sky, letting the calm sink in. When I climbed out dripping and breathless, Richard was on the deck leaning against the railing with a beer in hand. "Water feels good, doesn't it?" he said, his smile easy. "Perfect," I replied, toweling off as I walked up the steps. "Sam didn't leave you hanging, did he?" Richard asked, his tone light but curious. "Nah, he'll be back soon," I said, shrugging. "I don't mind the quiet." Richard nodded, finishing his beer. "You know the sauna is empty if you're looking to relax. It's great after a swim." The sauna, I'd forgotten about it. They'd added it a few years ago, tucked away at the edge of the property near the boat house. It had always seemed more Richard's thing than ours, but now that he mentioned it, the idea sounded tempting. "Maybe I'll check it out," I said, grabbing my towel. "Good call," Richard said, standing. "I'll fire it up for you." Before I could protest, he was already walking Toward the boathouse I hesitated for a moment before following him, the sun warm against my back. The sauna was small but cozy, the interior lined with cedar that filled the air with its earthy scent. Richard showed me how to adjust the temperature before turning to leave. "Enjoy," he said, his hand lingering on the door frame for just a second too long. I settled onto the bench, letting the heat seep into my muscles. The air was thick and humid, and soon sweat dripped down my skin. It was quiet, just the sound of my breathing and the occasional creak of the wood. I closed my eyes, sinking into the warmth, the tension in my body melting away. After about 10 minutes, the door creaked open and Richard stepped inside, a towel slung low around his waist. "Mind if I join?" he asked, his voice casual. I hesitated, caught off guard. The space was small, barely enough for two people, and his presence suddenly made the air feel even heavier. But what could I say? It was his sauna. "Sure," I replied, shifting to make room. Richard sat down across from me, leaning back against the wall. His towel barely covered him, and I found myself glancing away, focusing on the wooden planks of the bench, but my gaze kept flicking back, drawn to the way his chest rose and fell, the beads of sweat trailing down his skin. "You look tense," he said after a moment, his voice low and steady. "The sauna is supposed to help with that." "I'm fine," I replied, though my heart was pounding in my chest. There was something in the way he looked at me, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it made my stomach twist all the same. Richard chuckled, leaning forward. "You've got to let the heat work. It's magic. Loosen up." I nodded, trying to focus on anything but the way his eyes lingered on me, but it was impossible to ignore the shift in the air, the tension that seemed to thrum between us. And then he reached out, his hand brushing against my arm. "You all right?" he asked, his tone soft, almost concerned. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yeah, just not used to this kind of heat." Richard's hand lingered for a moment before he pulled it back, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's good for you, clears your head." I nodded, again unable to find my voice. The sauna suddenly felt too small, the heat suffocating. I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my skin prickle, a strange mix of anticipation and unease. The weight of Richard's gaze lingered long after he pulled his hand back. I tried to focus on the heat, the way it seeped into my muscles and made my body feel heavy. But it was impossible to ignore his presence. Thea felt smaller with him there, the space between us charged with an energy I couldn't explain. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint hiss of steam as Richard poured water onto the hot rocks. The air grew thicker, the heat more intense, and I wiped sweat from my brow. Suddenly feeling self-conscious, Richard leaned back against the wall, his posture relaxed, but his eyes told a different story. They flicked to me every so often, as if he were studying me, waiting for something. "You've grown up a lot since I first met you," Richard said, suddenly, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Hard to believe you're heading off to college soon." "Yeah," I replied, my throat dry. "Time flies, I guess." He smiled, a soft, knowing expression. "It does. Seems like just yesterday you and Sam were running around here like a couple of kids." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The way he spoke, it wasn't just casual small talk. There was something deeper in his tone, something that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't quite understand. Richard leaned forward, slightly resting his elbows on his knees. "Sam's lucky to have a friend like you," he said, his voice lower now, almost intimate. "Someone he can trust. Not everyone has that." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "Hek, my best friend," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "We've been Through a lot together, Richard nodded. His gaze never leaving mine. That kind of bond, it's rare, special. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded with something I couldn't quite name. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the moment. But before I could think too much, Richard stood up, his towel slipping slightly as he moved. My eyes flicked away, my face flushing with heat. Not just from the sauna, I'll leave you to it, he said, his voice smooth. Sometimes it's better to be alone in here. Really let yourself unwind. Yeah, thanks, I murmured, not trusting myself to say more. He gave me one last lingering look before stepping out the door, clicking shut behind him. I let out a breath. I hadn't realized I was holding my chest tight as I leaned back against the bench. The room felt quieter without him, but the air was still charged, like his presence lingered. Even after he left, I sat there for a while longer, trying to shake the strange tension that had settled over me, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the image of him out of my head. The way his eyes had lingered on me, the way his voice had dropped just a little too low. It was unsettling, confusing, and something else I didn't want to admit. When I finally stepped out of the sauna, the cool air hit my skin like a shock, and I wrapped my towel tightly around myself as I made my way back to the cabin. The lake shimmered in the fading sunlight, the sound of cicadas filling the air, but the usual peace I felt in this place was nowhere to be found. My mind was spinning, my thoughts tangled in a mess of confusion and unease. I reached the cabin and slipped inside. The familiar smell of wood and sunscreen greeting me. The living room was empty, the kitchen quiet, but I could hear movement upstairs. I hesitated for a moment before heading to my room, hoping to collect my thoughts and shake the strange feeling that had settled over me. But as I passed by the staircase, I heard Richard's voice. You all right? He called out, his tone light, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach flip. Yeah, I replied, pausing at the bottom of the stairs. Just tired. Richard appeared at the top of the stairs, his towel now replaced with a pair of loose shorts and a tank top. He leaned against the railing, his arms crossed over his chest as he looked down at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they held that same intensity from before, that same weight that made it hard to breathe. Sam should be back soon, he said, his voice casual, though his gaze told a different story. Why don't you grab a drink, relax a little, maybe later, I mumbled, avoiding his eyes as I headed for my room. Once inside, I closed the door and leaned against it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. What was happening? Why was I feeling like this? Richard had always been like a second dad to me. Friendly, supportive, someone I could trust, but now everything felt different, and I didn't know why. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, my thoughts racing. The way he touched my arm in the sauna, the way he'd looked at me, it wasn't just in my head. Something had shifted between us. Something I didn't understand but couldn't ignore, and the worst part was a small part of me didn't want to ignore it. The sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my thoughts, and I heard Sam's voice calling out. Relief flooded through me, and I quickly got up, pulling myself together as I headed back downstairs. Whatever had just happened with Richard the first needed to push it aside, at least for now. Back just in time for dinner, Sam said, grinning as he set a bag of groceries on the counter. What'd you do while I was gone? Not much, I replied, forcing a smile. Just hung out by the lake, hit the sauna for a bit. Nice, Sam said, grabbing a beer from the fridge. My dad's obsessed with that thing, says it's the best way to relax. I nodded, my throat tight. If only he knew, but the story didn't end there. Oh no, it definitely didn't. This was only the start of it, and I could have imagined. What was still to come that night during dinner, Sam chatted away about his girlfriend, his plans for college and all the things he was excited about for the summer. I nodded along, forcing myself to laugh at his jokes and respond at the right moments, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Richard. He sat across from me at the table, his expression relaxed as he joined in the conversation. But every so often I caught him glancing at me. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to make my skin prickle. The way his eyes lingered just a little too long, the way his smile seemed to hold something beneath the surface, it was unnerving, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was testing me somehow. After dinner, Sam suggested we watch a movie, something light and funny to end the day. I agreed, grateful for the distraction, and we settled into the living room. Richard joined us, sitting in the armchair across from the couch where Sam and I sprawled out. The movie played on the screen, but I barely registered it, too aware of Richard's presence in the room. About halfway through, Sam got up to grab more snacks. Pause it, he said, disappearing into the kitchen. I reached for the remote, pressing pause as the screen froze on a goofy expression. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I glanced at Richard, trying to act casual, but he was already looking at me. You all right? He asked, his tone soft, almost concerned. Yeah, I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. Why wouldn't I be? He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. You just seem off, like something's on your mind. I swallowed hard, my palms sweating as I gripped the remote. I'm fine, just tired, I guess. Richard nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. It's okay if you're not fine, you know you can talk to me. The words sent a jolt through me, my heart pounding as I tried to keep my expression neutral. Thanks, but really I'm okay. Before he could say anything else, Sam returned a bowl of popcorn in one hand and a soda in the other. He plopped back down on the couch, completely oblivious to the tension in the room. All right, let's finish this, Sam said, tossing a handful of popcorn into his mouth. I press play, grateful for the interruption, but my mind was far from the movie. Every so often I felt Richard's eyes on me, like he was studying me, waiting for something. The weight of his gaze was suffocating, and by the time the movie ended, I was desperate to get away. I think I'm going to head to bed, I said, standing up and stretching. Long day. Night, man, Sam said, giving me a lazy wave as he flipped through the TV channels. See you in the morning. Good night, Richard added, his voice low and smooth. I nodded, avoiding his eyes as I made my way upstairs. Once inside my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. My chest felt tight, my thoughts a tangled mess as I tried to make sense of everything. The way Richard looked at me, the way he spoke, it wasn't in my head. There was something there, something I didn't know how to handle. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers over me as I stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet now, the faint creaks and groans of the old wood the only sounds, but my mind was anything but quiet. I kept replaying the moments in the sauna, at the dinner table, during the movie, the way Richard's hand had lingered on my arm, the way his eyes seemed to see right through me. It was like he knew what I was feeling even before I did, and that terrified me. I tossed and turned, sleep eluding me as my thoughts raced. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that Richard was just being friendly, that I was reading too much into it, but deep down I knew better. There was something between us, something I couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore, and the worst part was a small part of me didn't want to ignore it. Something in me felt excited, especially when I thought of Richard. The first did not know what it was there yet, but I would find out soon after. The next Morning I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside my window. The sun streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room, but I felt anything but warm. My stomach was tight in knots, my chest heavy with unease as I got dressed and headed downstairs. Sam was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal. He grinned when he saw me, completely unaware of the turmoil inside me. Morning, dude, he said, shoving another spoonful of cereal into his mouth. Sleep? Okay, yeah, I lied. Grabbing a glass of water. You like a rock, he said with a laugh. My dad's out on the dock if you're looking for him. Said something about fixing the boat. My stomach flipped at the mention of Richard, but I forced a smile. Cool, maybe I'll head down there later. Sam nodded, oblivious as ever, and I felt a pang of guilt. He had no idea what was going on, no idea that his dad had crossed a line I didn't know how to deal with, and I didn't know if I could ever tell him. After breakfast, Sam suggested we take the canoe out on the lake, and I jumped at the chance to avoid Richard. The water was calm, the sun warm on our backs as we paddled out to the middle of the lake. For a while, it felt like old times, just me and Sam laughing and joking like nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and I couldn't ignore it for long. When we got back to the cabin, Richard was waiting on the dock, his shirt off as he worked on the boat. My breath caught in my throat at the sight of him, his tanned skin glistening in the sunlight, the muscles in his arms flexing as he tightened a bolt. He looked up as we approached, a small smile playing on his lips. Have a good time out there, he asked, his voice easy and smooth. Yeah, Sam said, hopping out of the canoe. Waters perfect today. Richard nodded, his eyes flicking to me. You look like you could use some time in the sauna again, he said, his tone casual, but his gaze intense. My heart raced, the memory of yesterday flooding back. I forced a laugh, trying to act normal. Maybe later, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't going to let it go. The afternoon passed in a blur. Sam and I spent most of it lounging on the deck, sipping cold drinks and soaking up the sun. He was in his element, cracking jokes and recounting stories about his girlfriend, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I envied him his carefree attitude, the ease with which he moved through the world. Meanwhile, I felt like I was carrying a secret that was growing heavier by the second. Richard stayed near the dock, tinkering with the boat every now and then. I caught him glancing up at us, his gaze lingering just a little too long. Each time my stomach tightened, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to act normal to keep up with Sam's energy, but it was like I was walking on a tight rope, every step more precarious than the last. By late afternoon, Sam decided to head into town to pick up supplies for dinner. You want to come with? He asked, pulling on his sneakers. Nah, I think I'll stay here, I said, trying to sound casual. The thought of being alone with Richard made my skin crawl, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it. Sam shrugged, grabbing his keys. All right, cool, be back in a bit. As his car disappeared down the gravel driveway, the cabin seemed to fall into an eerie silence. I stood on the deck, staring out at the lake, the sound of the water lapping against the door doing little to calm my nerves. I considered grabbing a book or going for a walk, anything to avoid being in the same space as Richard, but before I could make a decision, his voice broke through the quiet. You all right? He called from the dock, his tone easy but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I turned, forcing a smile. Yeah, just enjoying the view, he nodded, setting down his tools and wiping his hands on a rag. It's a good one. Peaceful out here, isn't it? Yeah, I said, my voice tight. He walked up the dock, his movement slow and deliberate, like he was testing the Waters, he said, stopping a few feet away from me. It's just us now. We could talk if you want. My throat went dry about what he tilted his head, studying me about what's been going on. About yesterday, panic surged through me. My hands clenching at my sides. I don't know what you're talking about. He stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. Come on, don't do that. I know you felt it too. I shook my head back away slightly. I don't know what you think happened, but it did. He interrupted, his eyes locking onto mine. And it's okay. You don't have to be afraid. Afraid, the word echoed in my mind, striking a chord I didn't want to acknowledge. I was afraid. Afraid of what he was saying, afraid of what it meant, and most of all afraid of the part of me that didn't want to pull away. I think I'm going to go for a walk, I said, my voice shaky as I turned toward the woods, but before I could take a step, his hand was on my arm, stopping me in my tracks. His touch was firm but not forceful, his grip sending a jolt through my entire body. Wait, he said, his voice low. You don't have to run. I froze, torn between the instinct to flee and the strange pull that kept me rooted in place. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away as possible, but my feet wouldn't move. I could feel his presence behind me, the weight of his gaze heavy on my back. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said, his tone softer now, but I think we need to talk about this, about us. His expression didn't falter, his calm demeanor only adding to my frustration. I know it's complicated, but I also know that what happened yesterday wasn't one-sided. You can deny it all you want, but I saw it in your eyes. I felt my face flush, a mix of anger and embarrassment coursing through me. You don't know anything about me, don't I? He asked, stepping closer. I see the way you look at me. I see the way you react when I'm around you. Can try to hide it, but it's there. My chest tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He wasn't wrong, and that terrified me. There was a part of me that was drawn to him, a part one didn't understand and didn't want to admit, but giving into that part felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. I need some space, I said, my voice barely above a whisper as I turned and walked. I didn't stop until I was deep among the trees, the sound of the lake fading into the background. My heart was pounding, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of everything. How had things spiraled so far out of control? What was I supposed to do now? I sank onto a fallen log, my head in my hands as the weight of the situation settled over me. I felt trapped, like I was caught in a web I couldn't escape. No matter which way I turned, I couldn't see a way out, and the worst part, a small part of me didn't want to escape. A small part of me wanted to see Richard, and not only see him, but do so much more. The woods were quiet, the kind of stillness that only seemed to exist in places far from the chaos of everyday life. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional chirp of a bird, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I had come out here to escape, to clear my head, but all I could think about was Richard. His words, his touch, the way he looked at me, like he saw right through every defense sense I had. I wasn't sure how long I sat there staring at the ground, lost in a swirl of emotions. I didn't know how to untangle. Part of me wanted to stay out there forever, hidden away where no one could reach me, but another part, the part that terrified me, wanted to go back, wanted to face him, wanted to see where this could lead. That part won when I finally stood up and made my way back toward the cabin. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. My heart beat with every step, a mix of anticipation and dread building in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to say, what I was going to do. All I knew was that I Couldn't keep running from him. As I approached the cabin, I saw him. Sitting on the deck, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. He was staring out at the lake, a beer in his hand, his posture relaxed, but when he turned and saw me, his expression shifted. His eyes searching mine as if he already knew why I had come back. I stopped at the edge of the deck, unsure of how to start. The air between us was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that made it hard to breathe. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft, careful. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "I just needed some time to think," and he prompted, setting his beard down and turning to face me fully. "And I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is all so confusing." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "It doesn't have to be," I hesitated, my heart racing as I took a step closer. "But it is. You're my best friend's dad, Richard. This shouldn't even be a possibility, and yet here we are," he said, his tone calm but firm. "You can't ignore what's happening, and neither can I." I felt my chest tighten, his words hitting me like a tidal wave. He was right, I couldn't ignore it anymore, but admitting that felt like stepping off a cliff with no idea where I'd land. "I don't know what you want from me," I said, my voice trembling as I looked at him. "I don't know what I want," he stood, then closing the distance between us in a few measured steps. His presence was overwhelming, the heat of his body, the intensity of his gaze. I could feel my resolve crumbling, every wall I had built up breaking down piece by piece. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said, his voice low, steady, "but I need you to be honest with me, and with yourself." Honest, the word echoed in my mind, cutting through the haze of confusion and fear. Could I really be honest? Could I admit what I'd been trying so hard to deny? I started, my voice faltering. "I don't know if I can do this." He reached out, then his hand rushing against my arm, the touch sending a jolt through me. "It's okay to be scared," he said, his tone soft, "but don't let that fear stop you from feeling something real." His words hung in the air, heavy and charged, and for a moment I felt like the world had stopped spinning. My heart was pounding, my mind racing, but when I looked into his eyes, all I saw was understanding, no judgment, no pressure. Just him waiting for me to decide. I made my choice slowly, hesitantly. I closed the gap between us, my hand reaching for his. His fingers intertwined with mine, warm and steady, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me, a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. He didn't move, didn't push, just waited, giving me the space I needed. When I finally looked up at him, I saw something in his eyes that made my chest feel lighter, and in that moment, standing there on the deck with him, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this didn't have to be so complicated. Maybe it could just be the sound of gravel crunching under tires snapped us out of the moment. Sam was back. Richard stepped back, his hand slipping from mine, the reality of our situation crashing down around us. But as I turned ahead inside, he caught my arm, his gaze locking onto mine. "This doesn't change anything," he said, his voice low but firm. "We'll figure it out." I nodded, my heart pounding as I slipped inside just as Sam's car pulled into the driveway. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, but one thought stood out above all the rest. This was just the beginning of something amazing. I don't know if it is okay what we do. I mean, he's Sam's father. Father, do you think it is normal to do this, or do you think I should not care as long as we both enjoy? Please let me know what you think of it in the comments.